I created the Biological Winter Games, a yearly fitness challenge for my primary family to try to incentivize my family as well as myself to act mostly healthier in order to extend lifespan. In this video, I want to outline, first of all, the structure of it, then the implementation of it, and then I want to also mention some challenges I faced. The structure of it. So there are three main parts to this, and these three main parts are also in part based on findings. So in terms of cardiovascular health, so we have a couple of different buckets now. The first one is cardiorespiratory fitness or health. The second one is metabolic fitness, and the third one would then be strength. Now, I've to a certain extent copied this from other biological age calculations. The most noteworthy one is the one made by eGym, a company that makes smart gym devices, and they also make apps for fitness chains that then calculate their biological age based on a variety of inputs such as VO2 max, such as resting heart rate, which one might copy from fitness trackers such as GARMIN, Apple, and so on. The main problem with now VO2 max. So first of all, VO2 max is the main predictor of cardiorespiratory fitness. So that's both the heart and its system as well as the lungs and its system. In many studies, VO2 max is actually taken as kind of the best predictor and to a certain extent also as a proxy for then cardiorespiratory fitness. Now, the main problem is to try to measure VO2 max. Now, the proper measurement is actually done on a treadmill with a mask on, which then measures the breath and what the breath is made up of. I never did a VO2 max test because well, first of all, it is also financially probably quite draining. Second of all, there is also a problem with continuity. Now, ideally, maybe I would get something like this done, but of course it would cost something. So what I've done instead is I've taken my own kind of approximation of this, which is a Garmin watch. And on this Garmin watch, whenever I run, and on this watch in particular, I think it's 70% heart rate max. And then in addition, you have to do this for at least 10 minutes continuously, I think. That's the threshold. If I now run like this, then it calculates a VO2 max estimate. Now, of course, that's only a VO2 max estimate. In the last 2 years, I've been able to increase my VO2 max estimate based on running. There are also different estimates in Garmin. I think at least cycling is also there. I'm not sure about other sports as well. I was able to increase my VO2 max as measured first on the Garmin on my first couple of runs from 53 to now 50. Not now again, because now again I'm down to 57, but I was at 59 already. Now, I do have a VO2 max estimate in Garmin, but many of the members of my family do not. Now, for this reason, there would be a couple of methods to measure VO2 max, or at least approximate it, which would probably be less accurate than the VO2 max estimate on the Garmin watch, because Garmin also has lots of other data. So one does input the height, one does input the birth date, and so on and so forth. And based on these things, it estimates the VO2 max. Now, if instead one does a Cooper test, which is a test where one runs for 12 minutes, and then depending on how long one has run, so depending on the distance, one then gets a VO2 max estimate. So if one does something like this, now this does not maybe take into account these other factors so much. So now back to the three main categories. We have metabolism, we have strength, as well as cardiorespiratory fitness. Then I need another estimate for cardiorespiratory fitness. I figured there would be two. So first of all, I figured there would be very many constraints on these measurements because these measurements should be ideally quick and they also should be ideally as accurate as possible. So I cannot burden my family members with so many different activities and tests and so on and so forth. And to a certain extent, they also probably don't want to do this anyway. Nonetheless, I decided to proceed with this and at least try to implement it. For now, cardiorespiratory fitness, I have heard on a at least YouTube video. So it's not a study, but it's a YouTube video. And in there, Dr. Rohan Francis, also known as Midlife Crisis, talks about the second most predictive value of cardiorespiratory fitness. And this, if I remember this correctly, was resting heart rate. Now, resting heart rate is, again, something that is not as easily measured as one would like it, I think. So similar to blood pressure, which if one measures it in the morning, as a doctor once told me, for the patients in the hospital right after waking up, then this might be different compared to during a workout. Now, because blood pressure seems to go up and down during the day, it's probably quite hard to estimate blood pressure and resting blood pressure more in particular, because it seems, at least to me, that there is kind of a lack of a proper of a proper word for this, or a proper standardization of blood pressure, because, okay, now the standardization that currently exists, at least according to Peter Attia, who said in an interview that one has to sit down for, I think, 15 minutes before the blood pressure measurement, and then one takes 3 measurements back to back, and then one takes the average out of these. And also there seem to be some problems with these automated cuffs, which basically do the compression part on their own. And so it's also probably quite complicated to measure blood pressure and resting blood pressure, at least if one wants to have it accurate. Now, how could I estimate resting heart rate? Maybe with just a 2 to 3 minute measurement. Maybe by having a person sitting down and taking a blood pressure measurement, and during the blood pressure measurement, the resting heart rate, or not the resting heart rate, but if we now assume blood pressure is measured in a way such that this would be awake resting heart rate, then, or blood pressure also, then the blood pressure cuff usually also determines a heart rate, which I then could use. The problem with this again is probably it's too wildly inaccurate. So if I take a look at my own measurements now on the Garmin Fenix 7S Pro, which is this watch by Garmin, then I can see that throughout the year, basically my resting heart rate on a weekly average basis goes up and down from as low as 40 beats per minute to now, as in December, currently 55 beats per minute. So if I would sample my resting heart rate as sitting down with a blood pressure cuff, then it probably would be not as accurate. And if I then would basically calculate an aging speed based on this measurement, then depending on whether I drank a glass of water before, depending on how well I slept yesterday, it probably would in total basically decrease the accuracy of all of these measurements combined, which then would kind of take from this whole project, because, well, if it's not that accurate, then it doesn't make that much sense. But of course now, there is also the time constraint, and the time constraint is something that is very important. So how could one measure resting heart rate without estimating or measuring VO2 max, and without then having resting heart rate only measured with a blood pressure cuff once? One could, in theory at least, even though the practical implementation of this is probably a little bit too much for the other family members that are not me, one could wear a watch that already then determines resting heart rate, and then just open up the app, and then basically the longer the time interval, at least that's what I think, the more accurate basically the measurement would be. For my own, I would take my yearly resting heart rate average based on Garmin, which in my case is 49. Then there is an internet calculator, which then kind of equates or correlates, again, the resting heart rate, which seems to have kind of a correlative relationship with cardiorespiratory fitness, and thus taking this as a replacement metric for VO2 max. And I could take this with this internet calculator and again have this result in a biological age, in this case a cardiorespiratory age. In terms of now the overall structure, I have cardiorespiratory fitness. I then ideally have an output that is an age, a biological age. The biological age I then set into relation to the chronological age of a person, let's say it's me. So the cardiorespiratory fitness that results out of my resting heart rate yearly average of 49 then would be 25.6, which I could set into relation with my current age, which is 29. But in terms of the age, I also rounded up. So I put in this Excel sheet and I round up basically the normal rounding rule of 0.5, because otherwise I think this would again kind of, depending on the different birth days of the year, it would kind of decrease the accuracy of this. So I'm rounding up basically from 0.5 on, I think it's. Then for the 3 different categories, which are again metabolism, strength, as well as cardiorespiratory fitness, I then have a relation, which is then the biological age divided by the chronological age, which is then an aging speed. So this aging speed, it's a lifetime average aging speed. I can then take all of these 3 together and then calculate a aging speed in total. The next category would be strength. Now strength is very hard to measure, and there are also other dimensions other than strength. So one would be power, and so on and so forth. For this particular topic, I would maybe recommend listening to Andy Galpin, maybe on the Huberman Lab, but he also now has his own podcast. So grip strength seems to be correlated to very many things, and positively and negatively. For example, one correlate is depression. So the higher the grip strength, the lower depression seems to be, at least based on an overview I actually took a look at. I'm now citing from Richard W. Bohannon, grip strength, an indispensable biomarker for older adults. Abstract. grip strength has been proposed as a biomarker. Supporting this proposition, evidence is provided herein that shows grip strength is largely consistent as an explanator of concurrent overall strength, upper limb function, bone mineral density, fractures, falls, malnutrition, cognitive impairment, depression, sleep problems, diabetes, multimorbidity, and quality of life. Evidence is also provided for a predictive link between grip strength and all-cause and disease-specific mortality, future function, bone mineral density, fractures, cognition, depression, and problems associated with hospitalization. Consequently, the routine use of grip strength can be recommended as a standalone measurement or as a component of a small battery of measurements for identifying older adults at risk of poor health status. So I got a dynamometer, which is a small device which I don't have here right now, and you can basically press once onto this device and then you have a grip strength measurement. It kind of measures the peak usually. So mine, for example, would be depending on when I measure and depending on how fit I am currently and depending on when I worked out last. The last couple of days it was, I think, around 46, which is, I think, in the lowest 10th percentile, even though I have been strength training now for, 16 years. Now, of course, one could do 20 push-ups or as many push-ups as one can do and one leg standing tests and so on and so forth, but these all take time. And this thing, I figured, is also to a certain extent gamifies the whole experience. And this actually turned out to be something that is more, so this was kind of unexpected, that there was a greater acceptance rate for the grip strength measurement, mostly because it did not require that much background. The higher the number, the better. So grip strength as a proxy for overall strength, which then again also to a certain extent replaces the other dimensions of strength, such as, not of strength, but of muscular. Well, there are many different things connected to this, obviously, but I decided on grip strength mostly because there seems to be evidence on this. I also already had a grip strength meter, and so this seemed to be a useful implementation of basically the second category, now strength. Now I'm jumping back to cardiovascular fitness because I already have now the screenshots here. Mostly I am citing now Peter Attia's article on this. Peter Attia is a doctor that specializes in longevity, one could at least say. So on his website we find an article, and on this we find a graph, changing mortality risk based on VO2 max and cardiorespiratory fitness. And we find that survival probability is basically decreasing with a lower cardiorespiratory fitness, in this regard, not cardiorespiratory fitness, but basically VO2 max. Now, citing from his own results or conclusions. Results. Looking at all-cause mortality, there's a pretty clear trend. The two things that stand out are, there's a kind of monotic relationship between fitness and mortality. By far, the biggest gap is between the people in the bottom 25%, which are categorized as low fitness, and basically everyone above them. Going from just being low to being below average is a 50% reduction in mortality over a decade. If you go from low to above average, it's about 60% or 70% reduction in mortality. Then it just continues monotically to increase. The lowest improvement is going from high to elite. That doesn't buy a whole heck of a lot. It's not statistically, it still is statistically significant. Remember, the hazard ratio for mortality is the reciprocal of the hazard ratio for risk reduction. Here is what's interesting. If you compare someone of low fitness, I think this is again the bottom 25%, to elite, it is a 5-fold difference in mortality over a decade. They put this in context of other things that we commonly understand as being problematic for mortality, namely smoking, coronary artery disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and end-stage renal disease. That's a 41% increase in mortality over the decade. Coronary artery disease, 29%, diabetes, 40%, high blood pressure, 21%. End-stage renal disease, about 100% increase in mortality. But now, when you compare that to the difference in these fitness levels, it gives you a greater appreciation for how much improvement in mortality comes from improving your fitness. So going from the bottom 25th percentile to being in the 50th or to 70th percentile, which is a totally achievable feat, results in something which I do not have access to because I'm not subscribed to Peter Attia's website. Jumping back to grip strength. The question is, how do I calculate a biological age based on a grip strength result? Now, there is an app called GripMeter, and the GripMeter also has a website which is called Dexterity Diagnostics. If one input, or if I input basically a certain data set, this could be me, this could be my height, and this could also be the fact that I'm male, then I get a result out of this, and this result then is, at least if one is over the age of 40, a grip strength measurement. I asked ChatGPT or Copilot about this in this regard, I asked ChatGPT about this. So Copilot is the AI of Microsoft, or not AI, but the ChatGPT version Microsoft offers. And it mentioned that peak strength seems to peak for males at 35 to 45 and for females at 25 to 35. Jumping back to VO2 max and cardiorespiratory fitness. So when I put first on a Garmin watch, I had a VO2 max estimate of 53. Based on the Galaxy watch I wore prior in the last couple of years before this, I already knew that my VO2 max, or I already at least had basically some data in Samsung Health, that my VO2 max was as high as 54 already before. But I don't have more data. It would have been interesting to see the data in my youth, but I just don't have access to this. So I asked ChatGPT, if a 28-year-old increases his VO2 max, of course I'm not 28 for the entirety of the 2 years, but let's just assume it's like this, increases his Garmin VO2 max estimate from 53 to 59, what additional life expectancy is to be expected rather. Now, according to a couple of studies, we can now assume, at least that's what it kind of paraphrased said, is that we can expect a reduction of my mortality risk by 18 to 30% of not necessarily of mine, but I just mentioned a 20-year-old whose Garmin estimate is 53 and increases to 59. So how much lifetime would this potentially be? A meta-analysis has shown, so I'm now translating because the answer is in German, which I also speak. A meta-analysis has estimated that an increase of VO2 max could potentially, of 1 point, I think this is, for 1 milliliter per kilogram per minute, which is the unit. So VO2 max is basically measured in milliliters, and then if one basically scales this down to 1 kilogram of body weight, then one has basically a relative VO2 max, whereas the absolute thing would be the absolute VO2 max, so how much oxygen at maximum oxygen uptake one would uptake per minute. And so based on this meta-analysis, one could expect 0.2 to 0.4 years of additional life expectancy with every increase of 1 milliliter per kilogram per minute. So how much is this? We can just take 300 for the years and multiply this by 0.2, which is then the more conservative approach, and we would get an additional 2 months, basically, 60 days roughly. Now, again, taking the accurate numbers, with an increase of 6 milliliters per kilogram per minute, which I had, but now it went down to 57 again, we could expect 1.2 years to 2.4 years of additional life expectancy. Additional benefits, health benefits, a lower risk for basically heart disease, better metabolic health, improved life quality and function in age, and also better physical well-being. Now, for metabolic health, I figured the best estimate would be to measure body composition. Now, of course, body composition would maybe be more properly measured with a DEXA scan or something like this. So there is basically a continuum of things one can do to measure body composition. The first one would be maybe a body composition measurement on a smartwatch. There are also, so this body composition measurement would be bioimpedance, which means that an electrical current is sent through a certain portion of the body, and then it is estimated based on how much resistance there is, how much fat the body has. So mostly, as Peter Attia, if I remember correctly, put it, a measurement like this puts, or at least he said this about the DEXA scan, which is not a bioimpedance measurement, but he said it basically buckets everything into fat and else. But now, if one just measures body composition as not body composition but body fat, then one already has a somewhat vague estimate of basically how the body potentially looks like. Not how it looks like, but so if let's say I am what I am right now, and then I would be able to increase my muscle mass, let's say by 10 kilograms, but also my body fat would go up a couple, maybe 2 kilograms, then my body fat percentage would maybe still be the same. I didn't calculate the numbers right now, and also it depends obviously on how much I weigh. I could say I weigh 100 kilograms, I increase my muscle mass by 10 kilograms, and my body fat by 1 kilogram. One could then ask the question if this is a basically Pareto optimal reallocation of resources, in this case of body composition. The question has to be answered with what has been there before. Let's say before I was at a 10% body fat, which would be then 10% of the 100 kilogram would be fat mass. So in my case, this would be 10 kilograms. Afterwards, I would have 11 kilograms, but I would have 10 additional kilograms of muscle mass. Now, the 10 additional kilograms of muscle mass depending on the measurement. But if I take the in-body scale in my gym, which also has handles for the hands, which therefore probably I assume at least improves the accuracy of such measurement. And if I take the resulting 42 kilograms of muscle mass that I had with recent measurements, then I could increase it to maybe roughly 50 kilograms. Then the question is, what would the body fat, the relative body fat, therefore, then be? For this, we now take the 10 kilogram from the original 10% at 100 plus the 1 kilogram of additional fat, and then we divide basically the 11 kilogram of resulting fat by, again, the body mass, which then would be 11 divided by 110, which means, in terms of, if we now assume that body fat is kind of the main marker, or one of the easiest to measure markers at least of metabolic composition, then the body fat would be the same at both. We would have 11 divided by 110, and we would have 10 divided by 100. Now, there could be a conflation of interest. So this could be not necessarily optimal, but assuming I have additional muscle mass, the muscle mass also would to a certain extent protect me basically from the effects of the additional 1 kilogram of body fat, and I again would increase my grip strength maybe, as grip strength again is a proxy for overall strength. Back to the implementation. So for a couple of years now, I've measured myself in the morning, so initially in the evening, but then I switched to the morning on a body composition scale. And now I can kind of say, so at first I had it in athlete mode, which kind of interprets the results more as if you were an athlete, but now a couple of years ago, I decided to put it into normal mode. Mostly because all of these other measurements also have kind of more a normal mode and don't additionally put the athlete mode in. And also you have to meet certain requirements, but if, let's say, I'm hospitalized after a car accident, then I probably also don't fulfill the requirements of a certain amount of activity for a certain duration of time. Maybe for a week I need to train this much to have athlete mode activated properly. So I switched it to normal mode. Now a body composition scale is just a scale one can stand on, which has a couple of metal points, metal contacts on it, and then one stands on this scale. Now ideally for the measurement, one would do this in the morning, as this seems to, similarly to resting heart rate as well as resting blood pressure, be the most standardized measurement one can do. Also the fluids are kind of more out of the body, and also the digestion maybe has already finished the night before or then in the morning. So ideally, after one goes to the toilet, then in the morning, one measures basically the body mass at its lowest during the day, if one assumes one lives during the day and eats during the day and then sleeps during the night. Now, there is a certain inaccuracy of the measurement itself. So if I measure myself standing on a scale and then a couple of seconds later, then there is a certain inaccuracy. This could be 0.5%, maybe 1% even. Then if I put body lotion on my body, also on my feet, then this seems to decrease the amount of body fat that usually is resulting out of this. Then if you drink a liter of water, it needs to interpret the liter of water with probably lean mass because it's not more fat in the water. Therefore, your body fat actually decreases, I think usually, if I drink at least a liter of water before. So sometimes in the gym, for example, there is this in-body scale, and I stand sometimes on it, but I cannot, there is a conflict of interest of optimizing basically my nutrition and my day for going into the gym and training, as well as basically optimizing for a proper body measurement, body composition measurement. For the one, I need to be fat. For the other one, I need to be fasted, kind of, to put it into simple terms. And for an optimal training, I am ideally already hydrated, whereas maybe in the morning I'm not so hydrated. So it seems to be the case that at least for kind of my own data set, I now take the morning measurement, and this seems to be kind of the most useful measurement. And then I can see throughout the year how my body composition changes. It actually was as low as 13.6% now as a kind of normal measurement. And I also switched to a GARMIN Index S2 scale, and as high as maybe 15 to 16%. Now, again, if I have these daily fluctuations also with food volume and also basically with hydration and how well I'm hydrated, whether the body tries to hold on to water because I'm drinking not enough, or whether the electrolytes are imbalanced or something like this. So because of these factors, it seems to be the case that, again, an average would be more useful. Similarly, with resting heart rate, if I take the yearly average, then this is probably more useful as a kind of, and so I only take kind of the yearly measurement kind of for this metabolic or biological age challenge, or metabolic winter games, I called it. I basically only take a sample 1 time in the year. Now this is to a certain extent ridiculous, sampling only something like this 1 time a year and trying to kind of extrapolate throughout the year. But if one thinks about blood measurements and one tries to do a standardized blood panel maybe once a year, then it probably is also once a year. Maybe it's every 3 months, but then it's 3 months, and then the leukocytes So basically the white blood cells might be elevated because one did an interval workout right before. This is also something Andy Galpin, for example, mentioned, and this is also a problem I had kind of with my own first blood test, which I only took a couple of parameters, mostly because it's expensive to take a blood panel, especially if one then does additional parameters on this blood panel. But it needs to be easy. It needs to be something that is kind of, well, it needs to be easy. It needs to be something that is also quickly done in the measurement, but nonetheless, ideally as accurate as possible. So what I have landed on is that I take my body composition scale, and because I had another one before and I switched to the Garmin, I basically had one that connects to an app, which in the past used to be FearFoot, but the app crashes again and again. So I was able to connect it to another app, which is called Renfrew Health. Now, very luckily me, I now also have a metabolic age output in this app interpretation of the data. So I can create multiple user accounts. One can also spin out these accounts. So if a person decides, okay, I want to take care of my own body composition data, at least for the last couple of years or something like this, then I could potentially do this. Nonetheless, it seems to be, in terms of the display of the data, it seems to be more useful to have all of them as kind of my own accounts, sub-accounts, such that the data display is identical, such that one can compare this quite easily. So this results in a bone mineral measure, so basically a bone weight, bone mass. It also results in body fat. It also results in a couple of other things as well. Now, mostly I'm taking now a look at the resulting age. So one can think about this maybe as, okay, a person against the population average of their sex as well as their age group has a certain positive or negative trend. This could be me, maybe being slightly less metabolically healthy than I otherwise could have been in the last couple of years. But again, this would now only be a comparison against myself. If I now would compare myself against the population average, so this would be for me maybe 20 to 30 year olds, maybe it would be just 28-year-olds, then I could compare myself basically against the population average, which would then indicate a positive or negative trend. So if the average 28-year-old has more or less body fat, has more or less muscle mass as measured on this device, then this would indicate a positive and negative trend. The whole idea now about this biological age concept is that so basically age is something that we can understand. If there is an 80-year-old that looks and functions like a 25-year-old because he, well, runs a marathon in under 2 hours or something like this, which has not been done, but if it would be done, so one can basically create a display of the function and display this in years. And so one can then say, okay, I am actually younger, so 2 or 3 years younger, because I have the body composition that is more similar to the ones that is a 25-year-old, or at least in terms of my resting heart rate, it would be 25.6 years. In terms of my metabolic age, it is now 26. A couple of days ago, it was 25. Of course, there is a little bit of variance, but and there is also a lot of critique about this. And also, I had some problems with explaining this properly. And I actually wrote now kind of a formal explanation also for myself to put this basically down. And I also now decided to kind of translate this into English and to make it potentially useful for somebody else who wants to implement something like this. So, resulting is that I asked very kindly my family to stand on this body composition scale basically once. And I then recorded the measurement in Renfrew Health, and I then got a metabolic age output. Now the big question is, how do I all put this together? I therefore made an Excel spreadsheet. I basically have already the next couple of years in this spreadsheet. I then have the 3 categories. Each has basically a measurement, then the translation into an age, which I sometimes get from an internet calculator as in terms of the resting heart rate, but I do not have resting heart rate measurements for basically all the members of my family. Mostly I have one, well, basically for me and somebody else. Now, I just accept this, I think, and I just say, okay, the more data one provides, in theory, the more accurate this measurement will be, but the, well, less data is, then it still results in something, which then basically it defaults to the default that would be chronological age, which to a certain extent probably also is a very good predictor of overall health. If I'm 30, and I'm 60, I probably, well, am in different health states, and there are probably different functions that correlate basically just with chronological age. So basically the baseline would be a chronological, so basically a biological divided by chronological aging speed of 1, and then one can improve the baseline by providing more data, but the question is then also, is there a resulting incentive that one actually does not want, whereby withholding data, one basically keeps the aging speed lower. Now this whole idea of correlating basically function with biological age, or this concept of biological age, of course has many downsides. But I decided to nonetheless go with this because it seems to be a quite easy way to understand. Let's just assume now there are different parts of the family, different members of the family. One might be female, one might be male, one might be 10 or 20 centimeters taller or smaller, one might be older, one might be younger. The differences in grip strength, for example, how do they play now together, and what person is actually grip strength better than the other one? Of course, one has to take account basically the other factors as well, and therefore taking factors like these into account is then what a biological age calculation does, even though the overall biological age might not be equivalent to the actual measured biological age, which one would maybe take hundreds and thousands of measurements over the next couple of years, and maybe one cannot even determine it at all. There have been certain attempts, telomere length and other functions as well, not other functions, but other methods of trying to basically measure this. There is also the most prominent approach, which is currently DNA methylation, which also Brian Johnson uses for his aging speed calculation. In total now, I basically have this Excel spreadsheet. I also set up a folder in which I do have basically all of the different screenshots from the app in case I lose access to the app or something like this, and also to make kind of the data transparent, even though nobody seems to be interested. Now the initial idea was that I would basically have the resulting aging speed and then actually create a rank and see who is basically on top. The problem is now that I do have still a measurement which is kind of inaccurate, and I don't really know what to do with this, and so I have actually not made the final calculation yet. But the idea was that I would create basically a aging board, and then basically the person with the lowest aging speed would be on top, and then we could see basically from year to year how this would change, and thus create an incentive for everybody else, including me, to work harder and harder in my training as well as on the rest of my life, which then ideally positively influences these things. Not these things, but basically the aging speed. Ideally, the aging speed would go down, but of course now the aging speed again is just a proxy, and it's just a translation and a correlation and so on and so forth. In total, this has been a summary of trying to implement a biological age calculation with a resulting aging speed into a challenge that I called the Metabolic Winter Games because it sounded somewhat fun. I then switched it to Biological Winter Games because metabolic is obviously just one column of these three different ones, which again are cardiorespiratory fitness as estimated by VO2max, and again only the VO2max value is estimated by maybe an estimate, in my case with a Garmin watch, and in other cases maybe I switch to the resting heart rate, which I now can calculate, not for everybody but for some members, and then I have this fitness calculator. I then have the second one. The second one is the metabolic age, which I again have basically as one measurement, and the metabolic age is then an output of the bioimpedance measurement I have. And then the third portion is the grip strength calculation, not calculation, but measurement, which is measured with a dynamometer. Oh yeah, this is also something that's potentially interesting. How much did this cost? So since I already had the bioimpedance scale, and the bioimpedance scale cost me 30 euros once, this is kind of what it costs in terms of the metabolic health column. In terms of the grip strength measurement, I did not have to take time as well as other costs apart from basically the dynamometer. And this cost 50 euros on Amazon, even though I could have purchased it for 25 euros on AliExpress, which I saw later on. It was the identical device. In terms of resting heart rate and VO2max, it's a little bit more complicated. I do have a Garmin which cost a couple of €100, which is quite expensive. Before I had a Garmin 6S Pro, the Phoenix 7S Pro I bought new, the 6S Pro I bought refurbished for I think 330 euros. One could also get a VO2max estimate from a Galaxy Watch, which in many cases are quite cheaper or much cheaper, which sometimes sell for already 150 euros or something like this. And in Garmin, not in Garmin, in Samsung Health, one now also has the option to display, at least if one goes onto a running activity that met the threshold for maybe it's also 70% max heart rate for maybe 10 minutes. And if an activity running that there is an activity running that met these criteria, then there is also a VO2max estimate, and there is also a VO2max graph with all of the different points then, but this is not accessible as an overall metric, but only if one goes through this process of clicking on this and clicking through to the graph. Now the problem is there are multiple family members which might then want to do a running activity and might then also need a watch that tracks then this running activity and then results in a VO2max. I actually at this point do not have a VO2max translation to biological age, but probably there is something to be found. I kind of easier way would be to set up a watch for a new account and then basically switch the watch. So if I would have only one watch, then one could set it up to different accounts and then connect it to different Samsung accounts and then measure maybe for 1 day, maybe for 7 days, and maybe for a week. A week is 7 days, a month, maybe the entire year, and then have a resting heart rate estimate or measurement. Of course, it might not represent basically the underlying reality, but to a certain extent, it might approximate it. For example, if one charges the watch and has a lower resting heart rate, it might not be recorded. And the same is true if one sleeps and sleeps on his wrist, and then there is pressure on this device, and it might not be able to record heart rate. So the total cost and the actual cost for me was 0, mostly because I already had the bioimpedance scale, which now I brought to basically this place. And the grip strength dynamometer I also just brought with me. I only have one. And then in terms of the resting heart rate as well as the VO2 max measurements and estimates, it's a little bit more complicated. One ideally would have for every person, for every member, a smartwatch or a device like a Whoop that would actually then output resting heart rate, maybe also on average for a longer time interval.